About a year ago, around July, I was riding in Barcelona on the new Royal Enfield Guerrilla 450, the roadster derived from the Himalayan with the 450 single-cylinder engine. A year later, I got back on the bike. Why? Because last year in Barcelona, I really liked this bike's chassis. A lot, actually. In my opinion, the chassis could handle even more performance than the 40 horsepower of its 450 single-cylinder engine. And I wanted to get back on it for a moment to understand just how far you can push a 40 horsepower bike if you're looking for riding fun. When I reviewed the Royal Enfield 450 Himalayan, I asked you, is it possible to travel with 40 horsepower? A lot of you responded. The question I'm asking now is, can you have fun with 40 horsepower, even riding in a sporty way? To do this, I started this 1,000-kilometer journey by tweaking the Himalayan a bit, fitting it with higher performance tires, the Continental Sport Attack 4, and a slip-on exhaust that lets you better hear the sound of its single-cylinder engine. Now, I'm going to look for some twisty roads to really understand just how far you can push this bike. But maybe I'll do even more. Follow me. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at what you see when you get on the Guerrilla 450. I have to say that in the end, considering that the bike costs 5,550 euros, Royal Enfield has done an excellent job even in terms of the finishes. I'll start with the switch gear. Royal Enfield didn't just go out and buy off-the-shelf switches from third-party suppliers, but instead made their own, featuring these very distinctive switches that are reminiscent of those found on classic Royal Enfields, but everything is very modern. As for electronic features, the only concession is the ride-by-wire system, but there are also two riding modes that you can activate by pressing the M button here on the right handlebar. If you hold it down, it also changes the display mode on the screen, switching from an analog style, well, it's a fake analog since there's a needle, but it's still a TFT, to a digital display, as you can see. It gives you a lot of information, including navigation with Google Maps, and it's the only instrument cluster that allows this by connecting to your phone, which you can also charge using the USB-C port located right here underneath. I switch back to the analog display by holding the button down for a little while, making sure to keep it pressed until the change happens. Down here you can see the menu with the various pieces of information available, including options to reset certain values and so on. And the information is of course related to the trip. You have to pay a bit of attention because when using this little joystick for the information, you have to press right in the center, otherwise you risk moving the information instead of confirming it. Anyway, you have the two trip meters, range, real-time fuel consumption, battery voltage, how long until the next service, engine temperature, basically everything you need. And I have to say kudos to Royal Enfield because in a small round TFT dashboard, not a square one inside a circle, but a truly round one, they managed to fit all the information, which is sufficiently readable with numbers bigger than those on many bikes with larger displays. Everything is very clear, including Google navigation. The only thing I find a bit negative are the turn signals, which are down here. They're not very visible. I would have moved them higher up or at least given them dedicated LEDs because it's easy to leave them on by mistake. Another thing to point out is the two levers, which are quite large, a bit Harley-Davidson style, nice and sturdy, but neither the brake nor the clutch lever is adjustable. You know, I'm quite particular about this because for a bike like this, which is meant for all kinds of riders, I would prefer adjustable levers. That said, the distance is actually quite good. It's neither too far nor too close, so the compromise Royal Enfield has chosen works well. Bar end mirrors, which are optional. Of course, there's a whole list of options available for this Guerrilla. I have to say, I'm usually not a fan of bar end mirrors, but these actually offer really good visibility. I'd say we can start it up and head out to give it a test ride. As usual, my very first comment is about the overall ergonomics of the Guerrilla, which, if you remember from last year's video, I said I particularly liked and appreciated, and I also recommended choosing the higher saddle in order to have a slightly less closed, less aggressive leg angle. This adjustment, in my experience, can make the riding position feel a bit more comfortable and relaxed. In fact, in this version, I have the high saddle, and I have to say I like the ergonomics much more because it's true that you lose those 2 centimeters of height, or rather you gain them since the saddle becomes higher, but as you can see, you can still touch the ground without any problem. The difference is that you sit less, you're a bit less tucked into the bike, a bit more dominant over the handlebars, and this benefits an even more active riding style. An active riding style that the Royal Enfield definitely allows, because I can confirm that the chassis is very good, but we'll talk about that later. So in terms of ergonomics, the tall seat is highly recommended. It's an accessory that costs 170 euros. I'll also include a chart with everything that's installed on this Guerrilla, so you can see the accessories and their prices. I'd say it's 170 euros well spent, especially since I also rode with a passenger, taking my son along, and this seat is better for the passenger too because it's less sloped toward the back. But we'll come back to the topic of the passenger later and discuss it in more detail. The passenger is comfortable because the handles are well positioned and there's also space between the rider and the passenger. On a 450cc bike, that's not so common because the Guerrilla is actually about 1.5 sizes. It's a bit bigger than what 450s usually are, so it's also better for those who might be taller. It's a bike that's a bit more substantial. I'll point out the levers, which I already mentioned earlier. They're not adjustable, and I would like them to be. The grips are also nice and thick, quite substantial in diameter, and I'll also mention the rubber on the foot pegs, which cuts down on a lot of vibrations. I have to say, as I already mentioned during the Himalayan test, this single-cylinder engine, for being a single cylinder, really vibrates very little, at least as long as you stay below 6,000 RPM. And even after that, it still vibrates little, but you do get some vibrations on the tank and a bit on the foot pegs. But I have to say, there are engines with more cylinders than this one that vibrate a lot more. If you stay below 6,000 RPM, the engine actually lets you travel comfortably. So let's say cruising speeds are around 120 kilometers per hour, more or less. At 130 kilometers per hour, you're at 6,500 RPM. Aerodynamic protection is practically non-existent. This little windscreen doesn't really do much, but honestly, at the speeds you're going, it's not even that much of a bother. I'd say I'll finish with heat management, so the thermal comfort here is really excellent because the 450 doesn't get very hot. The bike is very open, and today it's 30 degrees. It's actually really comfortable. I'll move on to the engine in the next segment, and now I'll continue testing the Royal Enfield Guerrilla. As usual, my second point is about the engine. And I have to say that this Royal Enfield 450 single cylinder has turned out particularly well for two reasons. I already liked it on the Himalayan, I liked it last year when I tested it here on the Guerrilla, and now that I'm back on this bike, I have to say that in fact also because the measured weight is 11 kilograms less than the Himalayan, and almost all, well not all obviously, but quite a few are also on the wheels, since here we have two 17-inch wheels instead of 18 to 21 spoked wheels. This engine here can show off a bit. It feels a bit livelier. The engine turned out well because, as I said, it's the first ride-by-wire system that Royal Enfield has put on their bikes, and it's a ride-by-wire that I would rate at 90%. I'll explain why. It's always responsive, there's a good connection between the throttle and the wheel, and there are almost never any delays. There's always a slight hesitation that I had already noticed at the launch, and that I find again here on this model, specifically between first and second gear. It's as if when you shift from first to second, the ride-by-wire is just a bit slow to open, a bit slow to follow the throttle opening, and the power comes in just a moment later. But it only does this between first and second gear. It doesn't happen anymore between third, fourth and fifth. So I noticed it back then, and I can confirm it now. But I really like the engine because it's very smooth, it handles low revs well. You can even go below 3000 RPM in sixth gear, which isn't something you can take for granted with a single cylinder. It's true that it's a small displacement single cylinder, but still that's pretty unusual. And let's say it does its job. It performs best between 3000 and 6000 RPM, where it vibrates very little and always feels lively. It's an engine that feels a bit bigger than its actual displacement, with a responsiveness that's definitely superior to the Himalayan, and that definitely makes it more fun to ride. Then riding today on slightly more dynamic roads and wanting to push a bit more, given the somewhat sportier setup that Royal Enfield wanted to give this bike, I also use the upper part of the rev counter. It's true that the power drops off a bit after 6000 RPM, but you can still push it up to 8000 and the engine gets there. So I have to say that I really like the engine. I like it a lot, especially because it has a gearbox with very, very well chosen ratios, and it also works well when you use the clutch. Super smooth, never misses a beat. Even if you shift without the clutch, the gearbox is always nice and precise as long as it's not under too much stress, because if you push it too hard, the lever does get a bit stiff. However, the clutch isn't among the softest in its class, but it's still good. Maybe the lever is just a bit far away, but overall, I have to say the engine does its job. It has 40 horsepower. I won't tell you how much the bike weighs just yet, because I'll mention that later when we talk about the chassis. But do the math. As I said, it's 11 kilograms less, as measured by us, compared to the Himalayan. Still, I have to say that the engine really does its job. It manages to come out of corners well even in a higher gear, and above all, it's not the typical small displacement engine that you always have to keep revved to the limit to go fast through the bend. Here you keep it at mid-range revs, 3,000 to 6,000, and it does its job. You always come out of corners strong, and you almost never, actually you never get the feeling that you're in the wrong gear, because as I said, the gearing is really well set up. In the end, even riding up an alpine pass turns out to be a lot of fun, also because the chassis matches the engine's performance. In fact, in my opinion, it can do even much more. But we'll talk about that later, because right now I'm starting to head down this beautiful descent, which, by the way, has just been resurfaced. And then we're going to a rather special place to really see how far I can go with this Guerrilla. A quick note about the engine: I have been pushing it quite a bit, but the fuel consumption never dropped below 23.9 kilometers per liter. So we're talking about really impressive efficiency. It's true that it's a 450, but that makes the 11-liter tank, which isn't that big, still sufficient to get you through a whole day without having to constantly stop at the gas station. So regarding fuel consumption, we'll come back to it at the end of the review. But more or less that's the figure, around 24 to 25 kilometers per liter, which is really not bad at all. We've almost reached the end of living with the Guerrilla 450, and as is my habit, I always leave the chassis for last, because it's the part that interests me the most, and also because, as I said in last year's video, I think it's still the strongest aspect of the Guerrilla. I don't want to take anything away from the engine, because I have to say the engine really works well, but the chassis is, in my opinion, the most surprising part, especially when you consider that this bike costs 5,550 euros. In fact, I'll put up a table here with everything that's been installed. So this is the flat track kit, which means a high seat plus other things like the radiator guard. These aren't things that increase performance. Altogether, this bike, including the silencer, doesn't even reach 7,000 euros. As I was saying about the chassis, Showa suspension, a traditional non-adjustable fork, and a monoshock with linkage. And it's a chassis that convinces me because it's generally set up a bit on the stiff side, but the suspension doesn't struggle to start moving, so it absorbs bumps pretty well. You can tell that this is a bike that could be sportier than what its calm roadster image might suggest, if we want to put it that way. But in terms of dynamics, the bike really delivers. I assure you that over these past few days, I've been going up and down mountain passes, and I've had a lot of fun. Not just going uphill, but especially on the way down, where the engine is obviously helped by the slope and you can really go fast. Very well balanced, very well calibrated. Both the fork, which even when you push it hard or ride aggressively, never goes beyond its optimal operating range, and the rear shock, which, it's true, does transmit the occasional sharp jolt when you hit a bump at high speed, but I have to say it works well. I should point out that at the moment, the preload adjustment is set to the minimum, so we're at the lowest spring preload. This means the bike can also handle much stiffer setups, though I'm not sure it's really necessary, but it can do it. Also, I tried riding with a passenger, and I have to say that even with the preload at the minimum, it doesn't have any issues with excessive sagging. So I have to say that I really like the chassis, especially because now with this seat you're positioned more over the front end, and above all it's a chassis that works well even with tires like the Continental Sport Attack 4, which are actually really good, I must say. They obviously offer more grip compared to the stock tires, which are semi-knobby, so they encourage you to push harder in the corners. They have a higher capacity to let you lean, and they provide more lateral grip when you're cornering. But all of this doesn't put the Royal Enfield's chassis in any trouble, which means that basically the people who designed the chassis, I'm not sure if it's done in England or in India, but I think it's in England because, as you know, Royal Enfield bikes are made in India, but there's still a big English influence. In my opinion, they really know what they're doing. As for the brakes, I'll say it again, I would have liked an adjustable lever, but the braking has never gone off target, so it's always remained consistent. Even going downhill when you're pushing hard, it never fades. So from this point of view, I have to say it's really good. Maybe the initial bite isn't super aggressive, but I have to say the braking is definitely there. Rear braking, I'll point out again what I've mentioned before, and I also mentioned this on the Himalayan. This must be a bit of a quirk, let's say, of whoever develops the brakes at Royal Enfield. The ABS kicks in a second later than you'd expect, so the bike tends to lock up just a little before the ABS intervenes. This isn't a problem when the bike is upright, but when you're about to enter a turn, it causes a slight slide of the bike, which can actually be fun, at least from my perspective these days, since I took this bike to see how fun, sporty and lively it could be. But I realized that someone who isn't super experienced might not really appreciate this little slide, because it can make you feel a bit on edge for a moment. On the other hand, the front ABS is really good because it has a very high intervention threshold.
So despite its somewhat scrambler-like, somewhat classic appearance, let's say, but still being the least classic of the Royal Enfields, the Guerrilla actually allows you to ride in a very sporty way, even aggressively if you want. So it's a bike that doesn't just take you from A to B, but is also capable, if you want, of giving you a great day out, just like I had these past few days, actually more than one to be honest, riding actively, even if you're an experienced rider. I met people along my route who tried it, and everyone told me they were really surprised by how it performs, and it's true. But if we consider the starting price of 5,550 euros, let's just say that in terms of ride quality, suspension and everything related to dynamics, it's a bike that doesn't have many competitors. I'll finish with the weight we measured, 181 kilograms with 5 liters of fuel in the tank. That's 14 kilograms less than the Himalayan, making it a much lighter bike. That's why, even though the engine is practically the same, it performs in a livelier way. People always say that budget bikes are always very heavy, and it's true, here we're a bit heavier, but we're not that far, for example, from a bike that's considered very light in the category, like the Aprilia RS 457, which weighs 175 kilograms. We're just 6 kilograms heavier. It's true, it's 6 kilograms, but the difference isn't that huge. So there's some solid metal here, but the bike isn't excessively heavy. And above all, when you ride it, or even when you have to move it around, it hides its weight very well. Let's also remember that here it even has a center stand, so if we wanted, we could even shave off a bit more weight. So this is the last intervention regarding the chassis, and it's the second to last segment of this video, because since the bike has given me a lot of satisfaction on the road, and I actually struggled to even push it to its limits, I want to take one last step to really see how far it can go. Maybe we're stepping a bit outside its intended parameters, but in my opinion it could be worth it. Now I'll show you.
Here we are then. Clearly we've gone a bit outside the normal usage boundaries for a bike like the Guerrilla. In fact, you could almost call this improper use, but actually, well, I did pick a track, let's say a suitable one. I didn't go to Mugello. Instead, I came to the Castelletto racetrack where, well, guys with CBRs, Triumphs and all sorts of sport bikes come to spend half days hitting the curbs. And I threw myself in among them with a completely stock 5,000 euro bike, without touching anything except lowering the tire pressure, which, as you can see, the tires have worked a bit. They've picked up some rubber. By the way, compliments to the Continental Sport Attack 4. Obviously the Royal isn't a bike that puts extreme stress on the tires, but I have to say they've performed well. They pair nicely with the Royal's chassis, which, by the way, always remains very balanced even when used on the track. So it's clear that we're not talking about the typical use for a bike like the Royal Enfield, but I have to say I'm actually quite surprised, because usually when you take bikes that are completely out of their element onto a track, you do a couple of laps just for fun, and then the problems start. The rear shock stops working, the brakes start to fade. But with the Guerrilla, none of that happened. I did 2 20-minute sessions without ever stopping at Castelletto, where you brake hard, and I did not experience any brake lever fade, no suspension issues. And one of the things that really surprised me is that apart from the foot pegs, which are now pretty ground down, there was no contact with the ground at all, not even with the center stand. So let's say I got as far as to the extreme and even a bit beyond when it comes to the sporty use of a bike like the Guerrilla. But if someone, let's say a young person with an A2 license, wants to take their first steps with a bike that can actually grow with them as they gain experience, and why not, maybe even try a couple of laps on a small track like the Castelletto racetrack, this bike can definitely allow them to do that if they want. Of course, as you gain more experience, you start looking for something more high-performing. But I have to say, in the end, poor thing, I really pushed it hard, always keeping the engine in the red zone and all that, and it never had any kind of problem. There was no stiffness in the gearbox or anything like that. So, in the end, for what it is, it definitely gets top marks. On top of all this, I should add that I never turned off the ABS for any of the sessions, and it never kicked in, even though at Castelletto you have to brake pretty hard. This too is a sign of how at Royal Enfield the people in charge of the chassis really know what they're doing. There are bikes that are sportier or claim to be sportier than this one, but when you take them to the track, they struggle, especially with the brakes and ABS. None of that happened here. Obviously, we're talking about the kind of pace that the bike allows you to maintain, and it's just as clear that the riding position isn't super sporty. The foot pegs touch down quickly, but if we're talking about track days just for fun, well, you can definitely have a good time.
I'm wrapping up this day, or rather these 1,000 kilometers, because this is the last day, but of course we've tested the bike before as well, and I have a few thoughts to share. Today, out of those 1,000 kilometers, I did more than 200, almost 300, and in total, I spent 12 euros on fuel. The bike costs 5,500, and you really have to take into account what's happening in the world right now. Anyone who wants to ride a motorcycle and is looking for low-cost options will naturally turn to products like this. It's only normal because objectively, bikes like this let you enjoy riding without breaking the bank. It used very little fuel. Now I'm going to check the consumption live, even after the track session. Let's see. It's not showing me anything anymore because... here it is, the route. Okay. We've done almost 300 kilometers today with an average of 23.3, even after 40 minutes of full throttle track riding. So let's say that's something to keep in mind when approaching these kinds of bikes. You're always willing to forgive a few imperfections, and honestly, there really aren't that many flaws here. Things I would improve are simply the adjustable levers. The subframe, I'd prefer if it had bolted foot pegs instead of welded ones because, you know, in case of a fall, that could cause some issues. But apart from that, I have to say, when it comes to entry-level budget bikes, call them what you will, at this price point, there's really not much to complain about. I'll be waiting for you down here in the comments to talk about this rather unusual review. You know, I've even taken the GS on the track, so every now and then you have to do something out of the ordinary. About the Royal Enfield 450 Guerrilla or anything else you want to discuss, you know we always reply, so make sure to leave a comment below. See you soon, and we'll catch you in the next video.